So we have to deal with it. We need the security. It's a requirement. However, we can look at offsetting some of that overhead with other efficiencies.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Securing Your Law Firm's Reputation podcast series, hosted on law.com and sponsored by IVIONICS. I'm your host, Scott Ferguson. In the second episode of this series, called Adopting a Legal IT Security Framework, IVIONICS CEO Paul Sperry and Wayne Marino, the company's director of cybersecurity, sit down with moderator Mike Andrevet to discuss what a security framework is and how adopting the right one can improve a firm's cybersecurity posture. Paul and Wayne also discuss how adopting the right security framework can not only help protect data, it can also improve a firm's workflow and actually help lawyers do their jobs. Let's join their conversation.
Hello, and welcome to part 2 of our podcast series looking at cybersecurity and law firms. Today, we'll learn about setting up a legal information technology security framework. That's to protect law firms and their clients' important digital information. Our program is sponsored by the technology experts at IVIONICS. I'm Mike Andrevet, and I'm joined by Paul Sperry. Paul is the CEO of IVIONICS. Hey, Paul.
How you doing, Mike? Glad to be back.
Glad to have you. And we're also joined by Wayne Marino, who's the company's director of cybersecurity. Hi, Wayne.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for having us.
Great to speak with both of you again. In simple terms, what is an IT security framework? And maybe more important, how does it protect law firms and their clients' data?
Mike, I'm glad you said in simple terms. I knew we would be talking about security frameworks today. So in an attempt to impress our listeners, I took the liberty to look up the formal definition of a security framework on some of the Security Association sites like NIST and ISC2. And those definitions, I actually had to reread them a couple of times because they were so complicated and they're really, in my opinion, doing an injustice to the subject matter. Because I think it's quite simple. In my terms, as we like to describe, the IT security framework is simply a blueprint for managing risk and reducing vulnerabilities, or I'll often refer to it as the standard operating procedures for managing a firm's security. Not overly complicated. It's things that I think most have worked with for many years. But if you put it into the basics, it's a simple concept to understand. When I talk to lawyers, I'll often refer to it in a slightly different way, and I'll tell them it's in essence, it's the laws that are intended to protect both the firm and their clients' data, which they typically resonate with. The beauty of that is, they get to define the boundaries of what those laws are going to look like. They can be, as stringent as they want, and they can be lenient depending on the firm's risk tolerance, their security posture objectives, and other criteria that will come into the decision-making process. The challenge with it is always, when you create those laws, you got to live by those laws, which isn't always easy. And we've seen some, good examples of what that's looked like over the last couple of years. For some, the thought of a security framework is an overwhelming or a process that's not really worth, taking on, and they decide to kind of go it alone without a specific framework and take more of an ad hoc approach, as I like to call it. And that works for small firms, but typically, mid-sized firms really are not going to see the value and the benefit by taking an approach like that. We've been doing this a while, and I'm confident that the right framework and the GRC software to go along with that will lead to a significantly better outcome for them. GRC is the governance, risk, and compliance software, which is instrumental in implementing a framework. They go hand in hand, and they're often referred to as the playbook for security.
Well, I know it's not overwhelming, but it can sound it. And at the risk of making it sound more overwhelming, is there just one cybersecurity framework, or are there several for law firms to choose from? Depending maybe on their needs or circumstances. You mentioned one, big versus small, or simple versus complex.
It's less about the complexity of the firm, or the size of the firm for that matter, but it's more about the firm's practice areas, their clients, and their security concerns. So whether that be like privacy focused, control focused, or organizational focused. And what does that really mean is that, those different types of frameworks, whether they be about privacy is going to be more about, securing data and, who owns that data, make sure they have access to that data. And you have controls that are about how to protect, and how to set up those protections and configure them. Or you have organizational frameworks, which is like, how to secure your entire organization. How does HR onboard employees? How do they offboard employees? Who, manages certain vendors and things like that. So in relation to those things, your clients may have specific requirements, right? So, or based on the size of your company or where they're dealing with. But just to give you an example of some of those requirements or some of those frameworks that you might consider bringing on, there's like SOC 2, which you might have heard about, and that's a U.S. organizational framework. It tells you kind of like on a high level how your organization should operate and the different things that you should have within inside of it to operate securely. Let's say, for instance, you do a lot of international work, right? Well, in that instance, there's a comparable version to SOC 2, which is called ISO certification. And that ISO is, again, an organizational framework that has like controls in it to tell you how your organization works. But not only that, do we have these organizational frameworks, we have control-based frameworks like CIS. CIS is an international framework that tells us like how to set up your server, how to set up your workstation, how to do all sorts of things within inside your organization. And this like really defines at a granular level, like how to configure things securely and gives you multiple different layers to set that up, like whether or not you want to be slightly secure or super secure. And then we have different regulations, and these a lot of times are related to privacy, like I mentioned earlier. So let's say, for instance, you're a firm and you do a lot of work with healthcare companies, right? Well, you're probably going to be under HIPAA regulation, which means you should have a HIPAA framework within inside your organization that tells you how to secure that healthcare information so that this way it doesn't become compromised. Maybe you have a lot of clients that are in the UK, which that means that you should adhere to GDPR privacy laws, right? And those are the same type of thing. It's going to tell you how to secure your client's data in relation to those UK citizens. And even here in America, we have privacy laws. Like if you do a lot of work in California with California citizens, there's the CCPA, which is the California Privacy Act. And in that relation, you need to take into consideration that if you don't do these things, some of those privacy laws may have, penalties for not following them. So if you have a compromise and you're found to be not doing these things, there could be, high fines associated with not following these policies. So it's important to make sure that you take the time to find out what things are related that you should, related to your clients and your company and, those things that apply to you. And it's also kind of an important factor to kind of try to bake this into the process. Like the earlier you get in on this, the easier it is for your organization to kind of follow through with it. If you try to do this when you have 500 employees in your law firm, it's going to be a lot harder to change that, the mindset of 500 employees versus, 20 employees. So I kind of recommend, to get more serious about it when you're smaller, because it makes it a little easier to bake it into that process as you grow as an organization.
So, Wayne, for a law firm managing partner who may not, immediately think in technical terms, can you look at an IT security framework as a collection of guiding principles, maybe best practices?
Yes, I would say that's exactly what it is, right? It is a blueprint. It is kind of like a guideline for, best practices for a company to operate. But the bigger question here is like, how do you get started, right? Most of the time, these firms don't have what's called like a CISO or a virtual CISO, and that's a chief information security officer, right? Chief information security officer is the person that's going to have that higher level knowledge of all the things that we've been discussing and be able to guide you through that process. So one of the big mistakes is that if you don't have somebody that's skilled and qualified, you may be doing things that are wasting time and money and not actually moving you towards your goals. One of the things I just mentioned there is like certification to it. And the reason for our certification is that, you want to make sure that the security professional that you bring in is certified. So one of the certifications that you may look for is like somebody who has a CISSP certification. And that allows you to know that they kind of have a understanding of how to run security for an entire company. Once you get somebody like that on board, right, then he can help identify those different frameworks. Once he helps to identify those frameworks, the next thing you're going to want to do is try to get a plan together to implement those frameworks, right? And my recommendation would be to use like a GRC platform. And that helps you to kind of create a big blueprint of, okay, these are the policies, these are the controls, all right? These are, the vendors that we're going to be managing. It puts all this into, kind of like an application where you can kind of set individual ownership to each and every single one of these items. So you can set like a committee to go through the policies, right? You can assign it repetitious, validation of these policies so that this way you're notified. And this way you could systematically work through that approach. The GRC system can even, in some cases, help you write some of these policies and give you advisement on how to do things to kind of streamline processes for the company. The other thing is that what's great about the GRC is that the more time that you spend in there and the more time you get it all perfect the way that for your organization and as it adopts and grows for your company, you may want to turn around and go and say, hey, you know what? We've done so much work. Maybe we want to go get certified in some of these frameworks. And that's what's great about it is that you can go find auditors that will come in, evaluate your security and certify you in it, like an ISO and SOC 2. And then that's great because that's like an attestation or a certification that you can go and show your clients and prove to them that you're following, a certain set of security guidelines out there. And that brings a lot of value to your company. And at the end of the day, it's quantifiable and, it can actually help your organization.
Well, building on that, Paul, we tend to emphasize the security aspects of an IT security framework, basically protecting the law firm and its data. But can it also help a law firm do its work?
It can. Security policies and standard operating procedures, SOPs that I made mention of earlier, they're closely intertwined around the information, the documents, and for that matter, all the firm's digital assets. When instituting a security framework, it's really a perfect time to either update or create those standard operating procedures. I like to focus around like the critical workflows along the matter and legal project management functionality of the firm. We see that as really gaining the best efficiency results. Really looking at optimizing those workflow processes. I'd also recommend evaluating certain apps, particularly the document management, litigation support, and practice management systems within the firm. Both from assessing the security vulnerabilities, but more so looking at areas of functional improvement. Look, the reality is security initiatives rarely yield operational efficiencies out of the box. They're overhead. It's if you think about passwords. Imagine if we didn't have to deal with passwords or other authentication methods. How nice our life would be. Everybody would be working way more efficiently. But it's unlikely security will ever become that transparent where that's going to go away. So we have to deal with it. We need the security. It's a requirement. However, we can look at offsetting some of that overhead with other efficiencies, as I mentioned, previously. So our belief is that, if you take the right approach to this, that it is possible to, create a better overall attorney working experience and a more secure environment at the same time. And ultimately, that's what we strive for and we believe should be the goal with any of these initiatives.
That's really helpful. Okay, last question, and I've just got to ask. Sometimes within a law firm, the IT professional establishes the protocols, and then the lawyers and the staff seek to circumvent them. So lawyers are trying to practice law, and they sometimes feel like the IT professionals, just don't understand the work and occasionally represent an impediment. Can a proper security framework attack those kinds of problems?
Yeah, I agree. It's a common problem that we do see. A lot of times the employees don't really fully understand why these things need to be done, and they want to circumvent them. And that is an issue. It's not necessarily a problem with the framework, but it's a problem kind of with the process itself. And what does that mean? So, we could turn around and say, okay, the firm needs to use MFA. You all know kind of what MFA is, right? You log into your workstation or you log into a web page and ask you to put in some code, right? Lawyers may feel like that's a waste of time potentially, right? But they also got to understand why it's important. And, that's getting upper management's buy-in, understanding that risk, making sure that the users are aware of that risk, making sure that they understand the policies, they sign off on those policies, and they understand why they have to do it. Now, in that case, like MFA is just something that you have to do, right? Like there is no other mitigation to it. We just need to make sure that we're doing it. But in other cases, there's some things that we can do to help, alleviate some of that pain. So an example of that would be is like, okay, we're not, due to security concerns, we don't want our users using Dropbox, right? Well, maybe if we take away Dropbox, maybe we should give them an alternative, right? And, that could be like a document management system, right? Like we could say, all right, maybe you use NetDocs or iManage or many of the other things that are out there. And that will be another avenue for them to use. And at least we're not just taking something away without giving them something back. And that, helps get the employees on board with something because at least they know that they're doing it in a secure way. And the other aspect of it is that it's really important for upper management to have this buy-in and, continuously educate their users. They need to understand the risk that's associated with it. And if they truly understand the risk, they would understand like, okay, well, maybe if I don't do my MFA or I try to work around my MFA, I could put, the firm's reputation on the line. Or maybe it might cost some type of monetary value due to a data breach because I'm trying to circumvent something. Or maybe, the loss of data, of my client's data, maybe I might lose that client in the future. So if they truly understood all these different things, they may, take a step back and be like, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll talk to my manager and find a better way or work with them on a solution rather than try to, circumvent the system.
Well, for lawyers and law firms, it sounds a little bit like that quintessential short-term pain for long-term gain. Paul and Wayne, thank you so much. This has been very interesting.
Thank you, Mike. We appreciate that.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time.
That's all the time we have for today. And to our listeners, be sure to look out for the final part of this podcast series when next time we discuss securing your law firm culture. I'm Mike Androvette.
That's all the time we have for this discussion. Tune into other episodes in this series to learn more about cyber risk and cybersecurity. I'm your host, Scott Ferguson. Thanks for listening.